The kind of neutrality of things like cryptography. I mean, cryptography can be really important for something like WikiLeaks, for getting secrets out that governments are hiding that people need to know about. It's also really important for, cryptocurrencies, for moving money into areas where governments can't follow it potentially, for hiding it, for creating places where you can access illicit services and so on. So cryptography has that ability to hide anything that allows you to be secret.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. So Tim, thank you so much for joining me on The No Show. I'm really pleased to have you.
Great, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
It's excellent. So, I mean, before we get into sort of your book and stuff like that, we were just discussing before we started recording that you're the director of a newish course or sort of program at UCL. So, can you tell us a little bit about that?
For sure, I'd love to. I'm the director of the program in Arts and Sciences, and we have a bachelor called the Bachelor in Arts and Sciences. And this year we're starting for the first time a master's level course, the first in the world, Masters in Arts and Sciences in the area of creative health. And what we do on both those degrees is insist that our students learn across the full range of faculties that universities offer. So our students have to do humanities, have to do social sciences, and crucially have to do sciences. So they have to do some kind of connection, whether it be through to a kind of hard science like chemistry, genetics or so on. And then we ask them to pull that in knowledge across so that they're looking also at humanities or social sciences. So an example that's relevant to my own work was a student I supervised last year, had done quite a lot of learning around epidemiology. So she'd done quite a lot of biology, but serious biology with the biology students in their classes. And she was also interested in digital media, which is how she came to me. And she got interested in the notion of information as a virus. That's talked a lot about in kind of cultural studies of the digital. And so she compared what those people in kind of, social sciences say with what epidemiologists say about a virus, and brought those two forms of knowledge together and did a really interesting dissertation. And that's kind of a model of the kind of thing we want our students to be able to do.
Is this level of innovation that for me is really striking, that isn't so common in academia? And essentially what I take from it is that you're drilling this interdisciplinarity from early into students.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is the central point of the degree, which is, first of all, it allows students not to choose too early. So, if there's a student who kind of likes their maths or their physics or biology, but really they know their primary interest is perhaps in English or film studies or something, they don't have to choose if they come to us. They can continue doing both of those, and then they can curate their own degree. So there are core things that they have to do, but about 50% of their degree will be chosen modules that they decide to do. They have to get our approval, of course, just to make sure it's coherent. But they do those modules outside of our department. So our students are taking modules from all the departments across the university. And they can essentially, they have to have prerequisites. You can't in year 3, you can't decide to start genetics. You have to have done it at year 1, 2, those kind of constraints. But we help them curate a specific degree so that when they come out of it, they've really owned what kind of education that they want to get. And we make requirements on them. They have to do a language. We make sure they do some form of maths all the way through. But essentially, within the constraints we give them, they can create a degree which suits their interests that they develop from kind of year 1 through to their final year.
Honestly, I think it's amazing that you're encouraging this sort of level of, well-roundedness in education and academia, but more importantly, I think there's a confidence element that you're instilling in these students that they would not necessarily get otherwise.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think one of the things our students often mention to us after they finish their degree is how when they went out, they were well prepared to explain what they'd done and explain their strengths and their skills. So going for jobs, or if they're deciding to do further education, deciding what to do and persuading people to let them do it, going into jobs and deciding what projects that they want to push forward and so on. And that's because they've spent their whole degree discussing why they're going to do certain modules, why certain ideas are compelling to them, why certain areas aren't compelling to them. And of course, they try things and move on from them like we all do. So our students tend to come out very alert, very bright, very kind of connected to the world. They're very socially conscious, as lots of students are, but they're not kind of held clearly by a disciplinary frame which kind of tells them what's important and where to go. Rather, we're saying to them, okay, what do you think is important? And then we try and help them to access the kind of disciplines and the modules, the books, the ideas, the data that they need to really understand what they're interested in.
With any of these innovations that tend to, take place in academia, there's always critics. There's always, there are always naysayers. What have been some of the criticisms of this approach?
Some of the criticisms are that you become a kind of, to use the cliche, a jack of all trades and master of none. So that would be a core thing that we talk through with our students and try and make sure that they have at least a couple of threads through where they can say, well, actually, I've done genetics in year 1, 2, 3. I've done more than one module some years. I've done modules in health that are related. Actually, I've got real expertise in this kind of area. And therefore, the other things they've done, where they maybe done an English course or they've done some anthropology about documentary making, these things are additional. They aren't just distractions. They aren't separate things. So there is a bit of academia remains built on disciplines. Everyone in academia talks about how they're interdisciplinary. And very few people are interdisciplinary in the sense that we use it, which is you include sciences, or if you're in the sciences and you're saying, well, I'm interdisciplinary because I'm working, I'm kind of working, say, in about space, and I'm taking biology into astrophysics because we're talking about people going to Mars or whatever. On either side of that kind of divide between sciences and non-sciences, you can say you're interdisciplinary, when in fact you're working very much within those faculties. And our sense of interdisciplinarity is to go across those boundaries and to really get students to focus on what is the problem, what are the ideas, what are the things they're interested in, and therefore what do they need to know? What kind of disciplines do they need to know in order to be able to kind of access the knowledge that they want to generate?
I want to go on to sort of discussing a bit about your sort of background and research interests. Now, from sort of the profile that is there of you on UCL, and based on your interests, you seem to be a very forward-thinking academic, which is, it's seldom the case. A lot of the times academics are looking backwards at data and things like that, but you're very much looking forward in terms of looking at blockchain, looking at digital, the digital economy and things like that. So where does that approach come from?
It came from general interest, I guess. My initial training, kind of my PhD, was in social movements, protest politics, things like. And I guess underneath that, I was interested in the way people form their world, particularly in grassroots, deinstitutionalized settings. So that was a kind of broad-based interest. Then the first job I got at the University of East London, I was introduced. They were very strongly and very early into trying to create a digital office environment. So I was introduced into something that used to be commonly discussed then, isn't any longer, which is the paperless office. We all learned that a paperless office means that just before a meeting there's a long queue at the photocopier because everyone's trying to print off the documents at the last minute. But it meant I was introduced to email. I'd been aware of these things during my PhD, but hadn't really dabbled in them and hadn't really engaged with them. I had a couple of friends who were using online, Usenet for online discussions, but I hadn't really thought. And that world kind of exploded around me. So that was early 1990s. And so I happened to luck into this phenomenon as I was becoming an academic, with a framework which allowed me to think about what's going on here. And in particular, when I came across hackers, it seemed to me really clear that hackers were a community and that they were instead being pathologized. They were being treated as kind of psychologically damaged individuals, not as people with their own agendas and ideas, ethics and concerns, and that they weren't that different in many ways to social movement organizing, even though it was all done online. So I was able to take some ideas I already had, put them in this new technological setting, and my new university then was a kind of fertile place. And of course, as soon as you showed an interest in these kind of things, you immediately get placed on all the committees to deal with them, because no one else wanted to deal with them. And so I got a kind of front row seat on the introduction at that university later on to the introduction of the World Wide Web, which is really 93-ish, 93, 95 is when it really emerges, and that's when I started my academic career. And so I can remember sitting in a meeting of the kind of internet committee, as it were, and someone saying, there's this new thing that's emerged. If you put www. In front of things, it means you're on the World Wide Web. Something that is now so familiar, it started to disappear. And so I was just fortunate that I became interested in it. And of course, in academia, when you have something that's new, you both get told it's not very interesting. And in my case, it actually has turned out to be very interesting. And I even now have the slightly schadenfreude of seeing some of my colleagues who told me very clearly that this was just a set of boys' toys and not very interesting, who are now doing work in the digital, because you really can't avoid it in almost any area of academia.
I mean, as an academic, it must have been real fertile ground to look at these things, and obviously starting in the 90s and going through all these cycles of the 2000 crash, and then like all the emergence of like big data and big social platforms and things like that. I mean, for an academic, has it been overwhelming to the sheer size of how big this has got?
It has been, and it becomes hard to keep up. Now, this can be the same with other academic areas, of course, but this has been one where, so for example, I've done a lot, I mentioned hacking earlier on, I've done a lot of work on hacking. It was one of the early areas. I joined with a colleague, Paul Taylor, who'd done his PhD on hacking, and we wrote some things together, and we followed it through, but I really tailed that off towards 2010 or so. But of course, in academia, you still get known for certain areas, so I kind of keep in touch with that field, but I'm not really up on it anymore, because it's impossible in terms of the time of the day. I became very interested in the digital economy and a few other aspects of politics and economics and the digital world and what was going on there. And therefore, it just becomes very difficult to do anything more than kind of stay in touch with kind of the blogs that are about hacking and so on, and keeping a general eye on it. So the point at which I started to drift a little bit out of the hacking world is the point at which nation-state hacking became overt and really obvious. It had always been around, but the extent of it became astonishingly obvious through a number of bits of research and so on. And I was asked in just the last couple of days to comment on something, and I have to turn it down because I'm not really up in that kind of area. It's also about keeping yourself fresh thinking. If you keep working in the same area, and some people are capable of doing that and staying fresh, I quite like a new challenge, a new set of areas. But what I'd like to do is kind of bring the knowledge I've got that's a bit more broadly about the ideas around digital, internet, computerization and society, and take those into a new area so that it continues to build on my expertise. But it is really nice sometimes just to shift into other areas.
Before we sort of move on, I just want to unpack a little bit of something that you said a bit earlier on, which is you spoke about hackers as being, or early on as being these communities of people who, have their agendas. Tell us a bit more about that as a phenomenon.
Okay, so this has changed considerably in the last kind of 15 years or so with the arrival of nation state and to a large extent corporate kind of hacking. But there remains an underground or a deinstitutionalized kind of hacking scene that goes out there. And I guess the easiest way to explain it is most of us are over this now, but there was a period when people thought if you were sitting at your computer, you were by yourself. And therefore hackers were by themselves hacking into things. Whereas I knew from our research that every hacker sitting at a computer physically by themselves would generally have 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 different chat windows open to different groups. They were intensely social. They were multitasking their sociality, even as they were perhaps trying out new bits of software to try and break into new sites as they were collaborating. And that kind of collaboration, that kind of use of online communication is something we then saw burst out into what was called hacktivism, which is politically motivated hacking. The most famous of which is the sequence of anonymous kind of hacks and events that went on around that. And there you could really see how, instead of maybe being 20 or 30, a reasonable kind of community, which isn't that different to often the core groups of activists creating things like Extinction Rebellion and so on, of those working online, you had, hundreds, if not thousands in a couple of cases during anonymous events, people online working through chat groups, but often working through multiple chat groups, which also allows kind of abusive behavior of people tricking each other and so on, but also allows people to move through to have different kinds of... So they were very much, these were very much virtual social relations, which are now very familiar to all of us. If everyone thinks about the friends they generate through social media, and then it's not that different. It was just completely unrecognised at the time. The other thing that was unrecognised at the time is that hackers who realised they're physically co-present always got together. There was the early London hackers group from the 1980s and 1990s had a Chinese restaurant that they used to go out to once a month or so, and they knew if they went on a certain Friday, there was a fair chance they would bump into 5 or 6 of the other people in London who were interested in that kind of a thing. So hackers have always met face-to-face as well. And hackers have always been, the kind of underground hacking scene has always been the oddest scene, where for a group of people doing something which is usually criminal, even if they don't have criminal intentions often, they hold conferences, they publish journals, they give interviews, and so they're the oddest kind of criminals who would hold a conference on how to conduct what they're doing, and then ask law enforcement to come along and do papers there alongside with them and discuss what they're doing.
And this sort of common thread of like a community and sort of people taking initiative. Am I correct in saying this is also how, blockchain and cryptocurrencies really took off?
Yes, because they came out of a movement. I mean, nearly all these things have multiple threads, but I think if you're going to pick out the strongest kind of group that fed into cryptocurrencies, it would be a group called the cypherpunks, who were basically an online mailing list in the sense of an online discussion forum, where people who were interested in cryptography got together to discuss the implications of that and what that might mean. And you'll find that someone like Julian Assange is believed to have been a member at those, but you'll also find some of the kind of underground famous people. So there's a guy called John Gilmore, who's a founder of one of the co-founders of Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is one of the key, perhaps the key online civil rights organization in the US. He was one of the early employees at Sun Microsystems, which was one of the really important early internet companies. He's therefore a multimillionaire based on that kind of job. He was a cypherpunk and involved in that. So you have that kind of crossover. In that case, cypherpunks, although a kind of potentially global community because it's online and anyone can participate, had a very strong kind of what's often called a West Coast US kind of feel, very strong libertarian kind of sense to the politics, and a very strong sense in which how can we implement our politics technologically so the politics is unavoidable, which you can see in something like WikiLeaks. How can we create a system by which governments can't avoid us putting this information out?
And I mean, in saying that, there arises lots of different issues, and one of them is how do governments look at these groups?
Most of the governments have been very wary of these groups. Early on, perhaps ignored them a lot of the time. Particularly the police and security agencies were for a long time often a step behind. I don't think that's true any longer and hasn't been true for a while. If anything, those security agencies are now well ahead. and have levers that, kind of underground hackers don't have. If you can get, to discuss, Microsoft's code with Microsoft's coders because you're from the National Security Agency in the United States and you can claim it's security, then you've got you've got a way ahead that other hackers won't have. And similarly, you have in a number of countries a kind of crossover between criminal, government, underground hacker groups which have moved around, because the other big change around the time nation states really started to ever more heavily invest in this kind of technology was the arrival of criminal gangs effectively into online life, which really followed the arrival of, we believe, followed the arrival of gambling online. So the arrival of gambling online draws in a lot of people who have, for historical reasons, interest in gambling, and there was a pretty clear period, probably tracked best by Misha Glenny's journalism, but there are a few people in that, and tracked that arrival, and that then leads to, the kind of neutrality of things like cryptography. I mean, cryptography can be really important for something like WikiLeaks, for getting secrets out that governments are hiding that people need to know about. It's also really important for, cryptocurrencies, for moving money into areas where governments can't follow it potentially, for hiding it, for creating places where you can access illicit services and so on. So cryptography has that ability to hide. Anything that allows you to be secret has multiple potential kind of uses.
Mm-hmm. And as you moved away from sort of this hacking, world and researching it as an academic, what area did you have most affinity for?
I moved away a little bit. There are a couple of areas. I probably had a real interest in the emergence of information platforms. So there's a period which things that are very familiar to us, but there's a period where, particularly post, you mentioned the first .com bust around 2008. Post that is when what was called social media or Web 2.0 started to become kind of buzzwords and so on. And that's when information platforms which like Google, Facebook and so on, which really channel all our information and therefore get access to a surplus of information. Because from their point of view, if all our information channels through them, to a certain extent, they can then track correlations between us all. And it's the correlations that are really powerful for them. It's useful. It's more useful for governments to be able to track individuals and locate individuals absolutely in time and space. But for companies like that are particularly delivering advertisements, it's more the correlations which allow them to say, okay, for women between 25 and 28, this is the kind of product who are interested in, who have been to these stores and so on. Correlating all that information is really useful. So I became interested in that. Also became interested in online gaming. So I've threaded through work on online gaming. It's nice. Academia does allow you to do things that are fun and then to research them. And I enjoy online gaming myself. And it's nice to do something that's slightly more frivolous, something that you can occasionally surprise your colleagues with, but also something that is really powerful. It's a very large industry. It produces a lot of kind of social debate and so on. So those, and then in recent years, I really became interested in kind of trying to think more broadly about these things, so I was thinking about communication. So the work on gaming led into thinking about, okay, how do gamers communicate? And is there something about the way they communicate that's characteristically about the internet that didn't happen before the internet? And to do that bit of research, I did a bit of historical archival work and went prior to the Telegraph and did research on letters actually out to Australia from prior to the Telegraph arriving in Australia. So those are the early 1900s, so early 18, sort of late 18th, early 19th kind of century kind of letters. So those are the kind of areas. I mean, one of the great things about this is that if you've got kind of ideas about digital internet, you can take them into a number of different areas. And the last big bit of work I've done, which is most current, which I've mentioned a few times, is around the digital economy. That really came from my students, from teaching a course on that, thinking that most of my colleagues had really understood it. And year on year going through it with my students and them kind of making it pretty clear to me that they didn't really understand what was being said, and me thinking, actually, they're right. We haven't really understood this phenomenon very well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's almost like there's a crossover now, because you bring up gaming, and gaming has become its entire sort of own ecosystem, and it has its own sort of economy, it has its own networks and platforms where they communicate. So, I mean, online gaming is no joke. It's an enormous industry.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's entirely true. Sometimes you might have trouble persuading some of my colleagues in, for example, English, that this is the case. Now, there are some places where English departments teach computer games as another form of narrative, as another form of storytelling. And there are some places where they're puzzled why you aren't reading kind of classic texts and so on, and why you're doing these things. Games can also tend to be, and I know certainly the early games that I got involved in were of the kind of swords and sorcery kind, leading into kind of World of Warcraft and things. And amongst academics, sometimes that seemed a little bit embarrassing, explaining that in the weekend that I spent a fairly significant part of my time as a kind of half bull, half human, dressed in armour, meeting my friends. I'm over that now. I've gotten old enough not to worry about it quite so much as I might have done earlier on. But gaming is both industrially hugely important, probably as big. There's a big argument that goes on, which is very hard to solve, but it's probably about the same size as the film industry.
Sure.
Significantly bigger than the music industry. The film and games industries are much bigger than the music industry these days. It also has enormous cultural kind of impact, both visually, about thinking about things. I mean, for goodness sake, Boris Johnson uses levelling up as a kind of phrase, and I can't imagine he got that through getting, his kind of, gnome mage in World of Warcraft from level 79 to 80.
It's hilarious because, I mean, if I touch back on that point, the last data, I mean, I look at this data all the time, but the last bit of data I saw was it values at the gaming industry at around 200 billion annually. That's, that's an enormous size business. But, obviously the $1 million question is, what game are you best at?
Well, I came from, I already got into games. I came from the massive multiplayer online games
Oh,
world.
okay.
So my sequence was really playing lots of different kinds of games that were single player, but it was when it became multiplayer that it really hit for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that period that a number of us have, which I possibly had a bit later in life, and other people, where you play just that bit too much too often, and you need to really think, eventually get a hold of that in your life. For me, that was a game called Dark Age of Camelot that went into World of Warcraft, went into Warhammer Online. And recently I'm back in Warhammer Online, which is there's a retro game, which that is a game that was cancelled, it effectively failed and was closed. But a number of people, and I partly got involved in this game again because I liked it, but partly also because it's very interesting academically. A number of people resurrected it from code that they were able to generate.
No way.
And there is now a free version of that game functioning that is probably significantly better than the closed game that was commercially available.
And again, that just brings in the elements that you've looked at historically of hackers or coders getting together, for an agenda. The agenda doesn't have to be a political agenda. It doesn't have to be a social agenda. Sometimes it's just putting together a game.
It is indeed. And what happens then is that people generate, it's my job to kind of explore these things, but what I think happens is people start to generate an ethics and a politics without realizing it in that context.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of hackers would have said that they weren't political. They just wanted access to information. In famous cases, there have been hackers who did hacking because they believed that there was information about UFOs and aliens that were being hidden from people. And they would say, I'm not political, I'm just trying to access. And there were a lot of hackers who were doing that kind of work. The kind of politically motivated hacker, the epitome of someone like Julian Assange or a number of others, isn't necessarily the normal hacker. They're not often those hackers were playing a kind of intellectual game. Can I get access to this? You know, oh, this is a military server. This should be hard to get into. Well, that was easy. You know, that kind of intellectual game. But once you're in it, they develop an ethics. Particularly, they developed an ethics which has become increasingly important around the world, that information should be accessible and available to people. That information, more than that, however it's embodied, should be available for us to repurpose and change.
Mm-hmm.
So if the information is a song, a film, a meme or something like that, what people have learned is an ethics that actually I should be able to take that and mess around with that and play with it and give it back to everyone. So there's an ethics which comes from, say, free software coders into this, and an ethics that comes from gamers who, in most games now, particularly online games, you're allowed to make modifications of one sort. Like there are whole games like Call of Duty which are a modification of a different game. And that happens because people are able to learn skills, code, share them. The internet allows tremendous communication and sharing, which has good and bad sides, and allows people to build skills and generate things. One of the things I did during lockdown is buy a 3D printer, and I've started playing around with that. And I've been, you know, there are enormous numbers of models that I can just take and then learn how to print. There are enormous numbers of tutorials. You know, I could spend hours and hours just learning how to manipulate software models, then learning how to translate those into things that can be printed, or I can just take preset things and print them off when I need something, those kinds of things. And that process develops an ethic. Underneath all of those processes, an ethic that information should be available to us and should be free for us to use. And this runs directly into issues of copyright, runs directly into, you know, movie franchises that don't want to. It runs directly into the issues of how are artists going to get paid these days if, you know, their music is immediately ripped and given away for free, and streaming services are offering remarkably low rates per stream of songs and so on. So it produces a set of social principles, but it produces one ethic, which is, why can't I have access to that information? Why can't I add my, you know, kind of spin on this particular meme?
Do you think that the digital sort of world has created a new sort of hybrid ideology of capitalism and socialism, you know, where there's elements of capitalism, elements of socialism that fit people's preferences and can adjust to each individual?
Yeah, I think it has disturbed what might have been an easier left-right kind of distinction that we might have lived with. I was struck very early on about how when I was talking to or reading or looking at what was done by kind of hardcore libertarians in California in the US, who were very, you know, pro-gun, they were very anti-government, individual freedom was absolutely key. If I looked in digital context of what they were doing, their ideas weren't that different to people from anarchist and socialist backgrounds, particularly in Amsterdam and Berlin, who were also working on digital kinds of technologies. And there was a point for me where people with what ostensibly were very different politics were saying very different things. And it comes a little bit back to kind of, it's a bit of a broad generalization, but the notion that information is something that has changed in its nature and that we need to manipulate and engage and deal with more differently to how we have in the past. So definitely there's been, I think, a fracture across left and right. I think you see that fracture across kind of community organizing, in the sense that what a community is has become very different. I mean, I think one of the things that we see with conspiracy theories, the rise of what's called the alt-right and so on, is that the ability of using kind of cheap forms of communication for people who are like each other but distant from each other to get in touch with each other, which was something in the 90s and 2000s we thought was extremely positive in the internet, about the internet, allowing marginalized communities who might be in a rural area, might be the only person in that area, to be able virtually to communicate with people. That has allowed all kinds of groups to get access and to develop kind of a politics around each other. And that's where it starts to cut across, because all those groups have an interest in kind of freedom of information. All of those groups, whether it's gamers, whether it's God forbid, kind of QAnon kind of devotees and stuff, they're all really interested in secure, open forms of communication which allow them to move information and allow them to change and manipulate information.
So you've written a book called the Digital Economy, and the book touches on quite a few of the subjects that we've discussed so far. One of the things that stood out to me from the synopsis of the book was the fact that the book argues that actually the digital economy is not concerned with primarily selling stuff. That's not the sort of main goal of it. So tell us a bit about that.
I think that is a really neat summary of of a core way into thinking about the digital economy. The way I usually try and explain it is say, okay, let's take two of the biggest digital companies that if you stopped someone in the street and said, name a digital company, Apple, Microsoft, two of the companies that are likely to come back. If you look at their revenues, 80 to 90% of their income comes from selling things in a way that although the things they sell in Microsoft's case are digital, it's software, it's the Office, it's the operating system, it's that's where it's their server software. In addition to that, they sell Xboxes and things which are a significant component of their income. With Apple, it's nearly all things. It's iPads, it's iPhones. How different is that to selling cars? And so, in a sense, they're in a not that different business, qualitatively, kind of to many kind of manufacturing businesses. But then if you start looking at things like Google and Facebook, they're in quite a completely different, they're in something that's closer to advertising, but is still very different to it. They give away their core product for free. And in fact, it's essential that they do so. You can imagine one of the recurrent kind of ways in which people would troll each other on Facebook would be to try and trick people into thinking that there would be a premium paid for version of Facebook. And of course, Facebook for that would be almost catastrophic because everyone can simply leave and go somewhere else. Plenty of other social media. In fact, many people have left. People don't tend to leave Facebook because they tend to just leave their account there and not use it as often. But many people have left, whether it's Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, that sequence of other social medias that have arisen as we come along. They're in something very different, and it's crucial to them that they give away their product for free. What they're doing is creating, I mentioned information platforms before, and it's a rather broad term, but it's what they're creating is a platform over which information flows and which they can therefore capture. So they can capture and record. One of the things that's amazing about particularly Google and Facebook, Snapchat, any of these is that they capture vast amounts of data. One of their big businesses, Amazon's the same. One of the big businesses Amazon has is selling server time to people because they've developed these technologies to deal with massive amounts of data. And they do that partly for a couple of reasons, but primarily, particularly as they're starting up, they do that because that's where the answers are for them. What they found is a way in which they can ask answers of that of that massive amount of data, and then they can try and turn that into income in some ways. And Google it is who really invented, there are a number of precursors to Google, but it's Google who finally put together all the pieces, perhaps would be the best way to say it, of how you advertise based on an information platform, and turn from a company that was losing money to a company that now makes so much money that they don't, they're able to indulge their merest whim, whether it's a while ago they were thinking that they would try and bring broadband to the world with balloons. So they had, large hot air kind of balloons that they were putting up in the sky, looking for ways to do, to create kind of Wi-Fi nets and so on. A slightly lower tech version of what Musk is doing with sending satellites up to create a kind of low orbit Wi-Fi network around the world.
There's so much there that that people could really dive into, and part of the beauty of having somebody like yourself explore these issues, seeing it from really it's primitive years in the 90s through to what we have now. I think it's an incredible opportunity for people to to really understand, the digital economy beyond just the financial side of it, and really understand how it's been formed over the past couple decades. One of the things that you just said there, when you're talking about these big companies and sort of how they make their money, to me it sounds like right now the biggest companies are the ones that are, I guess, are able to organize data the best. Essentially, Google is, at the heart of Google, they're just a very organized, software that organizes the internet for you. So is it fair to say that, the organizing of this big data and this and knowing how to manipulate this data for the purposes of advertising or marketing, is that essentially why these companies have become what they've become?
Yeah, I think that's fundamentally yes. I mean, fundamentally, what I've sometimes called, and other people call, an information surplus. If you've got the platform that the information flows across, you can record that information. You can then start feeding that information back into itself. You can ask it questions again and again. So if you record a visit by me to a shopping site online 5 years ago, you can keep that data and you can keep feeding it into other data. You can keep reusing it. And that creates a process which technically is called recursion, but recursion's magic is you can take finite resources and turn them into infinite resources, and that's what they're basically doing. But you've got to have access to that large set of data in the first place. Now, we should also just be a little bit careful. They're not all very efficient. Sometimes just being big means you're just a great big lumbering giant, and you still can look at it. And we don't necessarily always have authoritative information on things like the amount of income per advertising click companies are making. And this is quite. I'm now going to quite old. I'm now going to quote quite old information. So I want to just be clear that I'm not sure this is still the case. There was a very period, probably 7 or 8 years ago, maybe 5-7 years ago, where Facebook clearly was highly inefficient, particularly compared to Google and some other online advertisers. But it was so big that if it's only making a small amount per transaction, there are so many transactions
exactly
that it's generating massive amounts of money. And there are other advantages these companies have. If you look at their structures, they have quite low, they look in terms of structure, if you look at the relationship between their profits and number of employees and so on, they look much more like kind of finance companies than they look like, say, a manufacturing company. They can get away with smaller bases of employees, and therefore they have a number of advantages that they can do. Not all digital companies are like this. We're really talking about the advertising companies. A company like Uber can't do that. Airbnb, the ones that are using that kind of a model whereby they're using the information platform to do something different than just advertising, they have different problems. And most of those are unprofitable, or it's unclear whether they're ever going to be profitable, or they're marginally profitable. They have a much harder time of it than do. And then there's the kind of group of companies that are really about things that in the past we would have thought we'd bought. So like, I can remember buying not just music CDs, but buying vinyl records as a norm. That's how you got music, at that point. Now I rent all my music, by using a streaming platform. If I stop paying that platform, or if I stop watching its advertisements or allowing it to advertise, then I will lose access to that music. Whereas if it was in a CD in my hand, I had it, for a long time. I had it, it was mine to own. Same with books. If you own a Kindle or any other e-reader, it's the same with mobile phones. Your mobile phone almost certainly can be turned off remotely by the company that sold it to you. So what you think is yours is generally... So there are a rented kind of thing. So there are these different models trying to implement ways of making money out of these information platforms. But at the core of it, if you've got that platform, you've got that information surplus flowing around. And then it's, how do you make something out of that?
Where can people find you online, and how can they sort of interact with you or your work?
I'm afraid I have avoided social media apart from family times, so I'm not really very available. people can find me if you just Google up Tim Jordan UCL. You'll find me, and my UCL email is available, and I'm very happy for people to email me. If too many do, then I'll stop responding. It's the same recurrent issue that everyone has in the online world, is that the toughest thing you can be is successful, because suddenly you are subjected to a flood of information, and you have too much information, and you have to then find ways of putting mechanisms to deal with that between yourself and information coming in. So I'm very happy for people to email me or catch me up that kind of way. But I generally am not on any of the main kind of social media. I'm afraid one of the things that I would seem to me to be clear from this time I started, and certainly even from the organizational psychological research from the 1970s and 1980s, was very clear that in online context, in computerized mediated contexts, people people spoke up more frequently. People would talk up hierarchies. They would say things to their boss or to someone above them in a hierarchy that they wouldn't say normally. People were a lot ruder. And I've been very cautious with social media over the years. So I'm afraid if you want to look me up on TikTok, you won't find me.
We won't see Tim doing the latest dance moves. Tim, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you, and I think your work is super interesting. And I urge people to really take a look at Tim's work. It does open your eyes to sort of how we've got to where we've got to, and also gives you sort of, in my opinion, some sense of navigation about what's to happen next. In terms of how things have evolved and where they might evolve. So definitely urge everyone to take a look at that. But thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to have you on again.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's been really interesting. Thanks for the really insightful questions.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.